Pregnancy, a time of such joy for some, such admiration for your body and excitement for what parenting will bring, but also for some crippling anxiety, weird aches, pains and cravings, and the prospect that you actually have to give birth to this baby at some point. Pregnancy can be a really strange period of your life and can feel so different for so many people. Season 2 of Bun in the Oven is here to help you navigate this bonkers time, alongside me, Holly Grant, whilst I also navigate this bonkers time during my current second pregnancy. In this season of the podcast, I'm joined by experts in all areas of maternal and perinatal health in real time throughout this pregnancy to cover topics that mean you don't have to spend hours on Google, down a rabbit hole with no real evidence-based answer at the end of it all. I've worked with thousands of women over the last 11 years, and specifically since launching the Bump Plan in 2020. I've heard everything and admitted everything, so don't worry, we cover the embarrassing, gross stuff that you're not sure you want to ask your best friend. See, this is the information you wish you knew before you even knew you needed it. I can't wait for you to join me on this journey as we work out what on earth we're doing together. Enjoy Season 2. In today's episode of Bun in the Oven, I'm talking about pregnancy sickness, a topic not often discussed but that's experienced by 70 to 80% of pregnant women, and at its worst is called Hyperemesis Gravidarum and can be completely debilitating. Personally, at 14 weeks, I've just come through that first trimester fog of pretty mild morning sickness and feel so lucky to have got away so lightly. Given my job, I know so many women who have struggled throughout their pregnancies with some form of pregnancy sickness, and the key here is you do not have to suffer in silence, and there is support out there. So in today's episode, I speak to the incredible Dr. Caitlin Dean and Megan Rossiter. Caitlin is a registered nurse and researcher specialising in pregnancy sickness and Hyperemesis Gravidarum, and is the chairperson for the charity Pregnancy Sickness Support. Megan is a certified midwife, hypnobirthing teacher, founder of Birth Ed and host of the Birth Ed podcast. Both Megan and Caitlin personally suffered with hyperemesis through their pregnancies and are so open about the impact this had on their lives. In this episode, we go into detail about what pregnancy sickness is, the sliding scale of severity, when to get support, what hyperemesis is and how it's treated, the stigma that is still present when it comes to pregnancy sickness, and how to support your mental health when facing pregnancy sickness or hyperemesis. This really does give great insight into a really difficult symptom and is ideal for those suffering, but also those who work closely with pregnant people. I hope this episode is helpful and provides you with the support you need. And now, ahead of this episode, a few words from our sponsor. Given the theme of this podcast, I imagine that some of you are currently pregnant or planning a family. So many women I know just aren't sure how to move their body safely during this changing time, or they want to stay active but need someone to show them the way and hold their hand. That's where the Bump Plan Pregnancy comes in. The Bump Plan Pregnancy is a holistic prenatal fitness plan that allows you to work out with confidence at each trimester of your pregnancy. Founded by myself, Holly Grant, the Bump Plan Pregnancy has already helped over 25,000 pregnant women stay active safely and feel empowered throughout their pregnancies. Through its trimester-specific workouts, in which I'm always at the same stage of my pregnancy as you will be in yours, extensive education hub, discount hub and growing Facebook community, you'll feel supported and part of a welcome community. Let me help you move safely through your pregnancy, maintain your fitness and strength, and enter parenthood strong and prepared for all the demands it poses. As a listener of Bun in the Oven, I'm offering you 20% per month off the cost of your monthly subscription to the Bump Plan, simply by entering the code BUN20 at checkout. To get started today, simply head to pilatespt.co.uk/the-bump-plan and enter the code BUN20 at checkout. That's BUN20 in lowercase to get 20% off the monthly cost of the Bump Plan Pregnancy. Join our community today and enter labour and motherhood strong, capable and prepared with the Bump Plan. Hi ladies, thank you so much for being on today's podcast. How are you both doing?
Not too bad, thank you. How are you?
Are you being honest though, Megan?
Well, I'm slightly recovering. I was ill yesterday, but I am feeling better today. Thank goodness.
So we always like to kind of start the podcast with a bit of honesty and a bit of reality, because as much as sometimes podcasts and content online can come across as polished or really smooth, and it can look like everyone's got their stuff together in the background, sometimes things happen. And so of all the podcast topics to talk on about yesterday, sadly, Megan was at a vomiting bug. So we've had to reschedule this, and you have very, very kindly agreed to talk today about this, and you're feeling 99%, or we what kind of
no, let's go 90%.
And Caitlin, thank you as well for being on today's podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you both. And actually, we put a story out on Instagram the other day about how we were doing a podcast about this and just asking for insight from people who've suffered with this during their pregnancy, and how it felt. And I'll go through some of the answers later on, because they were really, really sad, and just a bit of a shock for someone who hasn't suffered with this. But also lots of people saying thank you so much for you guys coming on and talking about this topic, because friends, family often found it quite difficult to be able to relate and understand, or people had never heard of it. So I really appreciate you both coming on and talking about a topic that you've also both suffered with as well. So thank you very much. So I guess we should probably start with you, Caitlin. So let's dive straight in with a bit of terminology, because when I first reached out to you about recording this podcast, you quite rightly explained that actually even the language I was using was kind of outdated now. I was talking about morning sickness, things like that. And actually, quite rightly, we're not calling it that anymore, or trying not to. So let's talk through the different variations of sickness during pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue people have with the term morning sickness is that it kind of makes it sound quite fluffy and kind of nice. And the reality is that most people have heard of morning sickness and expect it, and it's seen as a bit of a rite of passage and so on. But the reality of it is that it's really quite unpleasant, even if you have relatively mild sickness in early pregnancy. And it's very rarely limited to just the morning. So it's an inaccurate term anyway, and it's sort of it downplays the severity of it, really. And I mean, we've had women who, call our helpline, and their boss has sort of said, well, it's morning sickness. You just need to get up a bit earlier, and by the time you need to come to work, it will be over. And of course, that's complete nonsense. And so we're trying to move away from that, because it just sort of makes it sound a bit fluffy, and it's not a fluffy condition. So pregnancy sickness is the more correct term. And that's on a spectrum. It is a normal part of pregnancy to have some degree of nausea and or vomiting early in pregnancy. But what's normal is for it to come in waves. So you might have a wave or two of nausea in the day, at any point, not necessarily in the morning. And you might be sick a few times in the first trimester. But that it shouldn't be a problem in your life. It's something, like I say, it's a bit of a rite of passage, and most people look forward to it. It's a sign that the you are actually pregnant before you have any other real symptoms. It's a good sign generally that things are progressing correctly and so on. When it becomes abnormal is when the nausea is so constant and severe that it starts to interrupt your ability to eat and drink. It starts to become very depressing and miserable. And then hyperemesis is at the extreme end of that, where you actually can't really keep anything down, and the nausea is constant, and you start to lose weight and become dehydrated, and it really becomes very difficult to function at all. People struggle to understand. Morning sickness sounds so sort of almost fun, and it's definitely not fun, even with fairly mild nausea. But what people seem to sometimes struggle to understand with the terminology and so on is that there's a really big difference between a mild wave of nausea and the opposite end of the spectrum, which is absolutely bone-crushing nausea that feels like every cell in your body is poisoned. And it's on a spectrum. You can almost sort of, how bad is the nausea on a sort of 1 to 10 scale? 1 being just this sort of brief wave of feeling a little bit sick, through to that sort of very extreme, absolutely debilitating, where you can't think of anything other than the sickness that you're riddled with. And I don't know why people struggle to imagine that spectrum, when there's so many other things in our lives that appear on a spectrum. Pain, for example, there's a massive difference between a sort of a dull ache in your shoulder because you slept a bit funny, compared to the absolute agony of, I don't know, having your leg chopped off or something. And same with, and I think with things like COVID recently, we've seen some people have almost no symptoms and just feel a mild headache or a bit of a slight cough, through to life-threatening. So and actually so severe that lots of people have died from it. So there's lots of things in the world that appear on a spectrum, but for some reason, when it comes to pregnancy sickness, people find that hard to grasp. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. People tend to assume that everyone else's experience was the same as theirs. So if they had some mild nausea and someone else has hyperemesis, they think that it's the same thing. It's just that person's not coping as well or something.
Do you think because there is this spectrum, do you think it makes it actually really difficult for women to know when they might need to get support? Because if you've never been pregnant before and you've heard of morning sickness and you're being sick and you feel horrific, it's really difficult to know, okay, so is this just normal? Is this just morning sickness? I say just morning sickness, but like we've said, even morning sickness is horrific. Or is this hyperemesis? And when do I go to the doctor?
Yeah, very much so. And it's quite incredible the level of symptoms that women put up with before reaching out for help, because, like I say, it is an expected part of pregnancy. You think about films and stuff, like a woman being sick, it is absolutely affiliated with pregnancy and the first signs of pregnancy. So everyone knows it, everyone expects it globally. And so, yeah, it's incredible the level of symptoms women put up with, because they think that it's normal and that what they're experiencing, and that they're just not coping with it. And they beat themselves up over it. They think that they're just not coping with pregnancy. And they don't realize that what they're experiencing is not the normal thing that other people experience. It's more severe. And it's a shame that women do put up with so much before reaching out for help. And we need healthcare professionals to realise that by the time a woman reaches out for help, by the time she's gone to the effort of making a GP appointment, because let's face it, it's not easy to get a GP appointment. I mean, certainly my surgery, it's weeks unless it's a call on the day job. And even that, you can't get through. And when you do, all the appointments are gone. So, and then to take time off work to attend the appointment and all the rest of it, it's not easy. So if a woman's going to that effort of getting an appointment to discuss it, she's already long beyond the realms of normal. Women don't ask for help with normal pregnancy sickness.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And so, Megan, you suffered with hyperemesis. Can you talk us kind of through, what your story and kind of what can women expect? What does it feel like?
So I have had hyperemesis twice in 2 of my pregnancies, and sort of similarly to what Caitlin's just been explaining. I was actually a student midwife when I fell pregnant for the first time. So I was literally working like in the world of maternity care at the time. But I had literally never heard of hyperemesis. I didn't know what it was. I didn't even know that it was a thing. So I found out I was pregnant, and then about a week later was basically just overcome with like severe nausea, couldn't get out of bed. Within kind of 12 hours of that nausea, started being sick, and within a week or so of that was being sick between 30 and 40 times a day. And again, at this point in time, just thought like, God, morning sickness is so much worse than anyone ever told me it was going to be. But still sort of thinking that this was actually just what everybody did, but just again, that just nobody kind of talked about it, nobody mentioned it. Eventually reached a point where it just didn't feel like this could possibly be like safe or normal. So went to the GP. Initially, and obviously at this point I had been trying to eat ginger biscuits, had acupressure bands on 24/7, had been for acupuncture, had been eating little and often, had done like everything that's on the kind of Google what should you do if you're feeling sick and pregnant thing. But obviously, absolutely. And looking back in hindsight, I actually find it quite hilarious that I even thought these things might help me kind of in that moment. So went to the GP and they told me to drink ginger tea. Not particularly helpful. Eventually, over the coming weeks, it wasn't until the 8th time I was given like a mild kind of anti-nausea, anti-sickness medication, kind of like a first line treatment, which again didn't do anything other than make me feel like extremely tired and like totally kind of lucid and weird, but didn't actually stop any of the sickness. And then one weekend went in, I was pregnant over winter, so they had like sometimes our GPs are there at the weekend, like a kind of, I think, for flu and things. So went in and saw like a locum GP. And on the way out, I'd been given some more anti-sickness medication to try. This was my 8th trip to the GP in early pregnancy. Came out and collapsed in the waiting area of the GP surgery. And it wasn't until that point that I was then rushed to hospital and basically diagnosed as being like very, very severely dehydrated, because I'd been being sick between 30 and 40 times a day for a few weeks at this point in time. It took 7 different nurses, doctors, eventually the on-call consultant anaesthetist to actually cannulate me because I was so dehydrated. They eventually got a cannula into my ankle because they couldn't get into my hand or my arm or anywhere. And all of this is like, I basically have no memory of this whatsoever because I was just completely out of it. And then spent kind of several weeks admitted to hospital, trying different things to get it under control, being rehydrated. Eventually found a little bit of relief with a drug that's called ondansetron that I imagine Caitlin will be able to talk a little bit more about later. But basically spent the next kind of 16 or so weeks in and out of hospital being rehydrated with IV fluids several times a week throughout that bit of pregnancy. Obviously kind of completely off work. And as I mentioned, I was a student at the time, so I wasn't entitled to any kind of like sick pay or support, and after a certain point you basically just get signed off with absolutely nothing. So the kind of extra stress of basically, I mean, you're not paid anything as a student as it is, and then for that to then go to zero was all kind of like added stress on top of the kind of actual physical impact of being sick and being unwell. In my first pregnancy, I got kind of enough relief to eventually go back to work about 23, 24 weeks, which was different to my second pregnancy, but was on kind of medication right up until the birth, just kind of managing things with kind of quite high doses of anti-sickness medication. And so the care in my first pregnancy like massively impacted what that experience was like, for the worse, basically. A lot of not being believed, a lot of really having to kind of like fight and argue to like prove that I was ill, because apparently telling somebody that you're being sick 30, 40 times a day isn't enough to kind of be believed. So it was a really traumatic experience, and something that you'll literally never ever forget. So yeah, that was pregnancy number 1.
Yeah, and like you've mentioned, I mean, I was listening to that thinking, how do you continue to work if you already have a family? How do you continue to look after your other children? How do you even get out of bed in the morning, if at all? Like, it's completely debilitating.
Yeah, and that's when Caitlin was saying about that kind of it being a spectrum. Even sometimes if I say to somebody, you know, that I have suffered with hyperemesis, even then you sometimes get people going, oh yeah, I had that, like I was sick on the train every morning going to work. And I'm like, I couldn't, like, if somebody sat on my bed, I would be sick, because the movement of somebody sitting on my bed would make me be sick. Like, it wasn't, I couldn't even walk to the bathroom. So this wasn't like if I got on the train I would sit, which in itself, getting on the train and being sick is also horrible. But it was just not, it just wasn't even comparable to what that experience was. And I think because it is so hard to imagine, like, I genuinely think that people just can't even imagine it. It's so constant, and there's always this constant promise of like, oh well, at 12 weeks it will be over, or at 16 weeks it gets easier. And so you've kind of got these like hopeful deadlines in your head of when you're suddenly going to feel relief, and then you don't. And when you don't for the first time, you're like, is it ever gonna end? And the only deadline you know in your head is that, like, hopefully by 40-ish weeks the baby will be born, and then hopefully you might get some relief. But it just feels never ending, and 24 hours in a day is a really, really long time. And when one thing that I never got with sickness, which I know a lot of people have, is that, you know, if you've got food poisoning or you've got a sick bug and then you're sick, and then for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes afterwards you get a kind of a bit of a feeling of relief because whatever was upsetting your tummy has now left. You don't get that with hyperemesis. You feel just as sick after you've been sick as you did before you were sick. So there is absolutely no relief from it other than potentially being asleep. And if I could have slept my way through both 9 months of pregnancy, I would have been absolutely delighted.
And that kind of feeling of almost wanting everything to hurry up and be over was quite a common theme in the messages that we got. So I think now might be a good time to read through some of them. And I guess this is not kind of like trauma porn. This is basically just that if there is anyone listening that they know that some of the thoughts that they're having that potentially might make them feel guilty, that definitely shouldn't, they're not alone, that lots of other people feel the same. So some of the common themes were things like, at times it felt like I wanted to die or not be pregnant anymore. It was so hard. Actually, that was a common theme about people feeling almost wondering if they wanted to continue with their pregnancy, and then feeling horrific for even thinking that. But of course, I mean, this is a time where you're supposed to be the happiest you've ever been. And someone had got in touch saying that they'd even used fertility treatment and a donor, and even they were like, what have I done? This is hell. So awful, you'd rather not be pregnant anymore. A male doctor was extremely unhelpful, told me to try ginger and eat more often. Soul destroying, it's so hard and never ending. You're in a very dark place, mentally draining as well as physically. Utter hell, honestly didn't know how I was going to get through each day. And then makes you feel lonely. An experience that strips you of your personality and mentally puts you in a really dark place. And then people saying that they would never want to be pregnant ever again because of it. So Megan, for you had it on your first pregnancy, and then obviously you've gone on to have subsequent pregnancies. Did it kind of, is it one of those things that you never forget, that then when you then decide that you want to get pregnant again, you're thinking, do I want to go through this again? And does it happen every time? I know you've said it was 2 of 4, wasn't it, for you?
So for me, sort of, yeah, it definitely put our like family plans on hold. We would have had another baby quite quickly, but we needed to have free childcare so that Otis could be in nursery and we weren't having to pay for it. I needed him to be potty trained and not in nappies. So it needed him to basically be able to care for himself, be old enough to get his own drink, that kind of thing, because I don't know how anybody does it with a small toddler. I know people do, because some people didn't have it first time round and only get it second time round, so it comes as a kind of complete unplanned shock. So we did like a lot of planning with the help of pregnancy sickness support, who were amazing, just coming up with a kind of practical plan about how we could prepare as a family. So just preparing like family, like my mum and dad, my sister-in-law, people that could kind of help us with childcare, with food prep, with like emotional support, particularly also for my husband as well as me, so that all of that was kind of taken care of. And then coming up with We had a kind of preconception appointment with a consultant at the hospital, so that basically I could be assured that the care wasn't going to be what it was first time round, that I would have early access to medication, that I would have kind of direct access to the early pregnancy unit, that I would never have to try and convince anybody of anything, that I could kind of say what I needed and that it would kind of be given to me as and when I needed, which really, really did make like a huge difference, particularly emotionally second time round. So actually, in terms of the way that the hyperemesis played out, it actually ended up being worse second time round. But we never had any of the kind of fighting for treatment or the just kind of added stress that comes from not being believed about what you're experiencing. So yes, we did have it. So we waited kind of 3 years before we started trying for another baby. Interestingly, I had 2 pregnancies in between our boys. One ended up being an ectopic pregnancy, one was a miscarriage, and I didn't actually have hyperemesis with either of them, which for me, that was such a complex set of emotions to go through, because I sort of knew that it wasn't right. So I was sort of like wishing that the sickness would start just so that I would know that something was right, but also never ever wanting to feel sick ever again. So then when the third time I fell pregnant after Otis, and the sickness started straight away, it was again a kind of very complex set of emotions of like, oh, this definitely feels like when I was pregnant the first time, but also shit, am I allowed to swear? This feels like the first time that I was pregnant again. And so we did start kind of treatment very, very quickly, and that was escalated quite quickly. And I had like continuity of care from a consultant so I saw her every 2 weeks throughout pregnancy. So she could see from week to week whether I was looking better, whether I was looking worse. The longest that I was admitted to hospital was 3 weeks at a time, and every time that she was on shift, she would come and see me herself. So things like that, like just when care is good, it makes such a difference. And in that pregnancy, I did eventually find relief by going on steroids, which helped a lot, not in terms of the nausea, but they actually did stop the sickness. But basically the hyperemesis remained the whole way through that pregnancy. So we are very much very, very much done now. How people manage to do it again, I don't know. The emotional impact on me, like I'm totally traumatized from 2 pregnancies, but also on my husband and on my eldest son. I was pregnant for the second time during COVID, so that 3 weeks, that single stint that was 3 weeks being in hospital, I wasn't allowed any visitors during that time, and I had a 3-year-old at home, and he wasn't allowed in, I wasn't allowed out. I moved in with my parents, so I think there was like a 8-week period where I saw him like 6 times, and so it's not something that like, and he still remembers it, and so it's not something that we'll ever be doing, certainly not intentionally, ever again.
And how sad to hear that is the one of the main factors about expanding a family. That is such a huge consideration, and also well done on all the planning that you did going into subsequent pregnancies. But again, also so sad that there had to be so much forethought before you could even start thinking about having another child, because you didn't want that to happen again. So it's really sad to hear. And Caitlin, I'm kind of hearing what Megan's saying about, especially that first time round, collapsing because you were so dehydrated, and that can't be good for a baby. Is it with something like hyperemesis? Is there a risk to the baby, or is it just the mum that kind of suffers?
So we're increasingly starting to understand the impact of the malnutrition. So the actual condition itself, it theoretically isn't a problem for the baby. Although, as we've heard, incredibly traumatic for the person suffering. But the knock-on effects of it, so dehydration and malnutrition can increase. It's associated with problems such as cardiometabolic disorders later in life, for the offspring, autistic spectrum disorders and things like that. And I'm not saying that to scare people. And the vast majority of HG babies are absolutely fine. but it's important that you're aware of that when you're weighing up whether or not to take treatment for the condition, for example. Because as you heard from Megan, a lot of healthcare professionals are not very forthcoming with treatment, and you are met still, sadly, frequently with attitudes such as, well, it's not safe to take medication in pregnancy, or haven't you heard about thalidomide, and well, on your head be it, or use it sparingly because we don't know if it's safe. And the problem with all of that is that it's not true, actually. The medications that we use actually have great safety profiles, have been used by hundreds of thousands of women for generations now. And it ignores the whole fact that actually being malnourished, not being able to take your folic acid, for example, becoming micronutrient deficient, that can have consequences for the baby. So it's a really frustrating thing to hear when women are presented with this sort of fear around medication, but you're told, oh, but the baby gets everything it needs from you, and blah blah. And interestingly, it's to do with the stigma of the condition itself, as opposed to generally taking medication in pregnancy or around malnutrition. Because of course, if you're malnourished for another reason, for example, if you had an eating disorder, or some other thing, then also you would be told, well, you need to think about the baby. You can't. It's not okay to be starving in pregnancy. You're going to harm your baby if you don't eat properly. So it's partly to do with this whole culture around blaming the woman for whatever's going wrong in the pregnancy, and whatever decision she's making is criticised and scrutinised and so on. And actually, in developing nations, we really there's huge research about the impacts of malnutrition in pregnancy. The first 1,000 days stuff around, from conception onwards, that all originated because of malnutrition during conception and early pregnancy in developing nations. And the recognition that has a lifelong consequence for the offspring. So, and yet in this country, we leave women starving. Megan was so starving that she collapsed, so malnourished, so dehydrated. And that's just a bizarre thing to be allowing to happen to pregnant women in our developed, Western, medically advanced country. But it's not uncommon at all. I mean, I was told, oh, it's absolutely fine for the baby for you to be starving. The baby gets what it needs from you, and so on. So there's research increasing in that area, but we're still a long way from really kind of nailing that down. And to reassure women, the vast majority of HG babies are fine. The biggest risk to the HG baby, as you've sort of touched briefly on, is termination, because actually, if you are left without treatment, we have had women who have conceived through IVF who have gone on to terminate because they are so desperate and so just not believed and not helped. And it does happen a lot. And we do have women who become almost suicidal from it because they feel like the choice is between terminating or suicide. And it's a very serious condition for it to become that severe, and yet you're reaching out for help to your doctors and being told to try ginger. It's just
for it to be so serious that those are the two options that you feel that you have available to you is terrifying. And really, going back to what you mentioned about with medication, where doctors are kind of almost saying, well, you can take it if you want, but be careful. What women need.
Mother already. Before you even had your baby, you're a bad mother if you take medication in pregnancy.
Selfish. Women almost need to go to doctors and the doctor say, look, HG is horrific. Here is some medication for you. Like, do go away and have a think about it before you take it. But if you're really struggling, here is what's available to you. Is it kind of a lack of awareness or a lack of knowledge amongst the healthcare professionals?
It is, but it's also to do with the stigma of the condition. It's this idea that we should just suffer for our babies. And it's a lack of awareness about the consequences of not treating hyperemesis. And there is, the thalidomide tragedy. Younger generations now haven't necessarily heard of it, so I will just briefly. Thalidomide was a drug that was given in the 50s and 60s, before we really realised that anything the mother took or ate, or in those days, pregnant women were encouraged to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes, but we didn't really realise that things could harm the baby. And thalidomide was a drug that unfortunately caused very, very profound birth defects. And there's a lot of scandal around it because in some countries, such as Ireland, even after they realised that it was causing these defects, they continued to prescribe it. And they prescribed it for various things. It was a bit of a sedative, so any kind of anxiety and things like that it was prescribed for. But it was also prescribed for pregnancy sickness, and it was quite effective for that. And so I think that's what the shadow that's cast has contributed to a general fear of medication in pregnancy, but also a specific stigma around taking medication for pregnancy sickness, because for other conditions you would be prescribed the same medication, steroids for example. If you had ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease or asthma or lupus and you still wanted to have a pregnancy, you would be given the steroids without any kind of question over the safety. It would be like, well, obviously you need them. Obviously, just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you can't take these, because you need them. And yet, if you want to take steroids in order to survive a hyperemesis pregnancy and to maintain the pregnancy, you're met with kind of like absolute horror at the notion of taking steroids in pregnancy. So it's a weird kind of thing, and all we can do is keep persevering at raising awareness of these things, encourage research. There's loads of research around the safety of the medications. There's no excuse for doctors to be fear-mongering around the medications, which most of which have been around since the days of thalidomide, 50s and 60s. Even our most recent ones, like ondansetron, for example, has been around for 30 years now and is incredibly well studied. We have huge data sets on babies that have been exposed to it, and we know that it's really not causing any problems. But not taking it means that they're malnourished, they're not taking their folic acid, and so on, and that's where the harm can come. So all we can do is keep sort of raising awareness and these podcasts and things like that. And I do a lot of teaching session with healthcare professionals, and lobbying and getting guidelines out there and so on. And hopefully by the time my daughter is ready to have a baby, because it does run in families, and so she is at a higher risk now, hopefully things will be better and it won't be a fight for her to get treatment.
So hopefully we want it to be that medication for this during pregnancy is seen as a necessity, just like if they had Crohn's, like you said, rather than a nice to have or a it might help.
Yeah, just because you just don't want to be a bit sick. The other thing to bear in mind though is, unfortunately, as we've heard from Megan, she was then on everything by the sounds of it, including steroids, and I also took various different medications and tried steroids at one point, which didn't really help me. The problem is that for some women these medications do help, and ondansetron can often be almost curative for women, but for a lot of women the medications, they don't cure it. We don't have a cure for it. They manage it, they help to manage it. So they make it so that you're able to keep enough food and fluid down to not die, because it did used to be a major cause of death in early pregnancy, and they make it so that you can maintain the pregnancy, hopefully, but they don't generally get rid of the nausea. They may stop the vomiting, and they just may take the edge off really and make it manageable. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that was your experience, Megan, with that. It wasn't. It just doesn't. It doesn't get rid of it completely. It's still a real battle, which is why the planning and preparing in subsequent pregnancies is so important.
Yeah, I would just echo all of that. It makes it that you can potentially survive, and by survive I mean continue laying on the sofa or in bed for the next 9 months, not not necessarily go back to work or go back to kind of day-to-day life. And then there's just other things that even I remember that first week of my second pregnancy was the heat wave of August 2020. It was in the early pregnancy waiting room was like, I think it was like 34 degrees or something, and I had this dress, the only dress that I could wear, that I had to throw it away at the end of pregnancy because it was just like this sore reminder. It was the only thing that was like cool enough to sit in, but I couldn't look at it without just basically feeling physically sick. So yeah, all of those things that kind of complicate it on top.
And for Megan, for anyone who is kind of in the throes of it right now, was there anything else on, as well as medication, that you found helpful, or even any advice that you would have? Because I'd imagine it's not just the physical health, but from a mental health point of view, this must be devastating. Any advice?
So I definitely think that's one thing that is like completely overlooked from the kind of, even though my care in that second pregnancy was really good from a kind of medical perspective, at no point did anybody offer me any kind of mental health support within the NHS. If it was me planning it, I think that a mental health referral should be absolutely automatic for anybody that's diagnosed with hyperemesis. It should be part of the kind of standard package of care for that. So certainly mental health support either during pregnancy or afterwards, depending on when you can kind of even feel able to kind of talk about it. The charity pregnancy sickness support are amazing, and they can match you up with like a peer supporter. So at the moment I'm not volunteering for them, but between the two pregnancies did, where basically it's just somebody like at the end of a WhatsApp, at the end of a text message, that you can message saying all of the things that are in your head, and somebody's not going to think you're completely crazy, because they're all women that have been through it, experienced it. And so if you're sitting there in hospital and you're like, I absolutely hate this baby, they're not going to go, oh, but you'll love your baby. They're going to, yeah, I know, it's awful. And so just having somebody that gets it is potentially like a really, really helpful thing to do. I didn't discover the charity until kind of midway through my first pregnancy, and I could really have done with it earlier on, in terms of just accessing information on what medication you can take, when you can take it. They've got like a helpline, like a web chat, like loads of ways of kind of accessing support. So if you are listening and you've got pregnancy sickness, I mean, if you're listening and you've got pregnancy sickness, the chances of actually listening this far to this conversation are probably slim. But if you're listening and somebody you know has maybe sent you this episode, and they're struggling with pregnancy sickness, then definitely put them in touch with the charity, because it really does help just from a kind of emotional perspective.
Yeah, it's really good advice. And obviously, Caitlin's from Pregnancy Sickness Support is just the go-to. There are so many resources on there. So definitely, yeah, great advice.
Yeah, it helps to reduce the isolation, which is a major part of hyperemesis, is that isolation is just so miserable. So.
Well, physically, you can't leave the house, but also the chances of speaking to someone else who's had it might be quite slim. So you're going to have people saying, "Oh yeah, I felt sick as well," and you're then like, "God, I want to punch you."
And telling you to be grateful and telling you to think positively, and you just feel so isolated from even the people who love you, because you just feel misunderstood and that they don't get it. And so, yeah, I actually started the support network before my third pregnancy because I realized that I couldn't go through it alone again. So that was sort of 11 years ago nearly, and it's grown immensely, and it does massively reduce that isolation.
Yeah, you've done an incredible job. Caitlin, there's a few kind of, I guess, probably quite quick questions that I have just to kind of clear up still some things about hyperemesis. So the first one is there anything that can be done to prevent somebody having hyperemesis? And is there kind of a reason why one person might have it and somebody else doesn't?
Okay, so we haven't honed in entirely on the exact cause, but increasingly the research is pointing towards a genetic sort of fault almost, and a protein that's produced called GDF15, which the receptors for it are in the vomiting center of the brain. And women with hyperemesis, the wonky gene means that they potentially produce more GDF15 and that they respond badly to it. Now we can't, that's very optimistic, because potentially there's medications that would be able to reduce the amount of GDF15 in your system and also turn off the receptors to it, if you see what I mean. And it's also the thing that causes nausea and vomiting and muscle wastage in cancer, and therefore there's quite a lot of money going into that research, not in relation to pregnancy but in relation to cancer. So there's optimism for the future. In terms of preventing it, and because it's a genetic thing, I should just say that this issue about recurrence, yes, it's highly likely to recur when you've had it once, and you have to assume that it will. Very, very occasionally, we have women who have subsequent pregnancies without it, and it's quite possible that it was possibly a different cause for it in the first place compared to general HG. So you do have to assume that you will get it. Like Megan, I also had 2 miscarriages in which I didn't have hyperemesis, and I knew there was something wrong, and everyone was going, "Oh, it's brilliant. You're having a pregnancy without hyperemesis," and I was going, no. And it was a miscarriage and so on. So in terms of preparation, there's loads of stuff on our website. We can't prevent it. There's no medications you can take in advance to prevent it, but we can by starting a medication early before symptoms get bad. We can hopefully reduce the overall severity of it. And as Megan was saying, the preparation and the planning means that even if the symptoms are just as bad and we can't prevent it, you can manage it better in your life. And having that support and having, meals in the freezer and childcare and family and friends prepared to look after you and help you and support your family through it doesn't stop hyperemesis, but it does make it easier to manage. And there's, for example, I don't know, Megan, if you use the kids book about for if you've got a toddler already at home, there's a kids book that helps them to understand what's going on with mum and how they can help. And so there's lots of sort of practical things you can do, which isn't going to get rid of it, but it is going to make it easier to manage.
And the link to the book that you wrote, Caitlin, for children, How to be a HG Hero, and the other book, The Definitive Guide to HG as well, will be in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go straight there, then definitely do. Does it go away as soon as the baby arrives?
Usually, yes. Some women, it can take a few days. If symptoms are ongoing after the pregnancy, it's very important that you get that investigated, because there are other things that can cause nausea and vomiting. And if that coincides with pregnancy, then everything can get blamed on pregnancy. I'm working on the updated RCOG guidelines for this condition at the moment. And that's one of the things that we're trying to get in there, because it's incredible how many women get dismissed afterwards. There's not a lot of research on it, but there does seem to be a bit of a link with nausea and vomiting premenstrually after you've had HG. And if you experience that, it's reasonable to ask your doctor for antiemetics that you take prior to your period, because why should you suffer? I mean, you're not even pregnant, so their excuse about harming a baby with medication isn't even there. So if it doesn't stop, do get in touch and do seek help for investigations about other things. So things like hyperparathyroidism and stuff that can present a bit like this in pregnancy. So, but it should stop. I mean, for me, it literally lifted off me as the placenta detached and came out. It was like I'd been wearing a 20 kilo rucksack for 9 months, 24/7, and someone just lifted it off my back. I literally felt it lift away as the placenta detached and came out, and that was an incredibly, almost euphoric experience. But not everyone gets that, and it does, for some women it takes a little while, and if you've been on steroids all the way through, you're going to need to wean off them and things like that. So yeah, hopefully it will go very quickly, but don't be alarmed if it takes a few days.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Megan had sort of touched on the fact that it stays with you even after you've had your baby. Would you say that this is something that we talk about, if someone has a traumatic labour, that it can still affect them months later, and that maybe they should think about having some mental health support and PTSD and things like that? I mean, it feels to me like something like HG is something that would definitely need some sort of work
Very much so.
postnatally.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is very strongly associated with hyperemesis, and it can be very severe. And post-traumatic stress disorder is something that can lead to people committing suicide and so on. So, and if you're listening to this and a loved one of yours suffered with hyperemesis, be vigilant for the signs of PTSD, really, and reach out and try and get them help if they need it, because it is not uncommon at all to be traumatized by this condition. And not just the condition itself, vomiting to the point where you feel like you're suffocating and so on, but the trauma of being so seriously ill and not being believed. That is incredibly traumatic. So there is counselling help that you can get and so on. And obviously a lot of women, having been met with disbelief from healthcare professionals during the pregnancy, worry about the idea of going to a counsellor who also doesn't believe them. And it's like, sorry, you're traumatised from morning sickness. And we have had women who have had that experience, having been referred to counselling. So if you go through the charity, we do have counsellors. We're hoping to establish an in-house counselling service within the charity, but it takes money and all the rest of it. So we're currently sort of fundraising for that at the moment, and that will be with counsellors who really get it and understand, and aren't going to suggest that you should pull yourself together or whatever.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful to know. Megan, is there anything that we haven't touched on, or any bits of advice or anything that you'd wanted to say before we wrap up at all?
I don't think so. I think the only part that is kind of always overlooked in these conversations in the kind of wider context is just the effect that it has, particularly on the partner of if you've got a partner that is supporting you through hyperemesis. I think their experience is always kind of totally overlooked, and watching like the person that you love be so unwell for such a long time and not being able to do anything about it is, I think, really traumatic for them as well. And again, just if you can find somebody that you can kind of, as a partner, have conversations with, and you can contact the helpline, I think, at Pregnancy Sickness Support as well, because you need to look after yourself as a partner, and don't underestimate like what that experience is for you as a partner to experience. There's always, I think, a lot of pressure that you're supposed to be the like reliable one, the well one, the one that everybody is kind of leaning on, but to be lent on for that long is really hard, and doesn't leave you either.
That's really, really. I wouldn't have thought of that, but of course, if this lasts for 7, 8, 9 months, essentially, for your partner, they haven't got you around. They haven't got that contact with you. They don't know what to do. They don't want to see you in pain. They're taking on full childcare responsibilities and potentially the financial responsibilities of the house. So, of course, it's going to affect your relationship if you have one, and how they're feeling. So, great. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that at all.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that as well, and let the sort of particularly male partners who, like you said, there's this sort of society stigma on them to be strong and cope and so on. We can put them in touch with other dads and so on through the charity, but it's not uncommon for men to be like, we've had partners who would dash home in their lunch break to check that she was still alive. And literally going through the door terrified of what he was going to find, and dreading and not wanting to go to work because he was so scared of how ill she was. And yet when he takes her to the doctors, they're also met with this disbelief. And we've had partners who after the pregnancy are terrified to have sex with their wife because they're so scared of getting her pregnant. So if your partner's experiencing that, again, you need to get help. It's not the trauma is not when you. Trauma is often developed from a fear that your loved one is going to die. And it's not unreasonable for that to occur with this condition, because you just watch her wasting away and not being able to help and not being believed and trying to find help and not finding it.
Gosh, it's just such a sad thing to suffer from. There are almost no words. So I'm aware that for anyone listening, this is quite a intense topic. So we'll put as much support in the show notes as possible, and we'll make sure that we get as much links and books and things like that from both you, Megan, and Caitlin to direct people to. But I hope that this has been really, really helpful. I've learned so much from both of you, and I'm aware that you're sharing your own personal experiences as well. So thank you so much. And yeah, unless there's anything else we've forgotten, I'm going to
one last thing I would quite like to add. This has been very negative, like you say, and very sort of ugly, I guess, and the reality of it. But I do like to sometimes point out that there can be good things that come from adversity, and people worry a lot about the impact on their children when they see their mum suffering again and so on. I have 3 children, and my youngest obviously never saw me suffer because I was pregnant with her, but my older boys were 4 and 2 when I was going through my 3rd pregnancy, and they have grown into very compassionate, empathetic young men. Who I was sick last week. I was sick premenstrually, and my husband was out, and my 12-year-old boy, he supported me while I was being sick, which I do find very traumatic to be sick. And I also tend to wet myself because I pushed 3 babies out of my vagina. So he cared for me, and he looked after me. And actually, I think that their experience of me going through that as young children, it has actually had a positive effect on them. And in my own life, it's had positive impacts. Although I have, I can't ever drink Earl Grey tea again, and I have various kind of trauma associated with vomiting. There can be good that comes from it. And the women who volunteer for us become part of a community of strong, beautiful women who have an incredible community and you can heal from this by getting involved with the charity and being part of a community of women who are bonded by this condition. So I guess want to end on maybe something a bit positive.
And you're both amazing for using the experiences that you've had to help others. I think it shows huge resilience and selflessness as well. So to both of you, thank you. Well, that's a lovely way to wrap up, Caitlin. I don't think we could say anything better than that. So thank you so much to our listeners. I hope that you found that helpful. If you are suffering, I hope you can get the help that you need. And thanks so much for listening, everybody. Bye. Firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode of Bun in the Oven, and I hope you found it helpful. For more support, do head to the show notes below to find links and supplementary reading we feel may be helpful to you. Secondly, this podcast can only help those who know about it. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. While podcasts are easy to listen to, they take a lot of effort to create, and your support in sharing Bun in the Oven will help me encourage more guests to join me for future episodes. Thank you so much for watching today, and enjoy the rest of your day.